Get out of here within 12 hours. That's what she said, standing right in the middle of my cabin entrance like she owned the place. I hadn't even finished my morning coffee when I saw this stranger holding a colorful printed paper, pointing at my house and talking about community rules. This was the land my grandfather left me. I'd been living here for 3 years and never heard of any HOA. Then suddenly someone shows up demanding I pack up and leave like I'm some kind of criminal. Who do they think they are? If you've ever been bullied by people who think they run your neighborhood, you know this feeling. Let me tell you how this story ended, with the biggest plot twist you can imagine. The morning started perfectly normal in Ash Hollow. I was sitting on my front porch, drinking my first cup of coffee and watching the mist rise off the small creek behind my property. My grandfather's cabin sits on about 2 acres of the most peaceful land you could imagine. Tall pine trees, a natural spring somewhere in the back, and neighbors who mostly keep to themselves. At least, that's what I thought until this Tuesday morning when my peaceful life got turned completely upside down. The woman standing at my door had this fake smile that reminded me of a shark. Behind her stood a nervous man with a briefcase, shifting around like he knew something was wrong. "Good morning, Mr. Carver," she said with fake sweetness dripping from every word. "I'm Tessa Ellison, president of the Ash Hollow Homeowners Association. This is Clinton Ames, our legal advisor." She pointed to the nervous guy who looked like he wanted to run away. "We're here because your property breaks several community rules, and we need you to leave immediately." She handed me what looked like an official document, but something felt wrong. The paper was too bright, the fonts didn't match, and there were spelling mistakes I could see even without my glasses. I set my coffee cup down slowly, taking my time to look at both of them. The whole thing felt like some kind of joke, except these people seemed serious about whatever game they were playing. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake," I said. "I've been living here for 3 years, and this is the first time I'm hearing about any homeowners association." I explained that my grandfather bought this land and built the cabin, and I inherited it when he died. There was no mention of any HOA in the paperwork. Tessa's smile got even wider, which somehow made it scarier. "Well, that's because we recently expanded our area to include properties that were outside our community before." She pulled out what looked like a hand-drawn map. "As you can see here, your cabin now falls within our regulated area." The map was clearly amateur work. Someone had taken a regular property map and drawn new lines with what looked like a red marker. The new boundaries made a weird shape that seemed designed to include my property while leaving out others. "This doesn't look like any official document I've ever seen," I said, trying to stay calm. "Do you have real legal paperwork from the county that shows this boundary change?" Clinton finally spoke up, his voice shaking. "We have full legal authority under State Homeowners Association Rules, Section 4-12A, which gives us power over community safety and property standards. I've been a lawyer for 8 years before getting into real estate, and I knew enough about HOA law to recognize complete nonsense when I heard it. The section he mentioned didn't even exist in state law. The way he paused before saying it told me he was making it up. These people were either completely stupid or running some kind of scam. My money was on the scam." "That's interesting," I said, folding the fake eviction notice in half, "because that section doesn't exist. The real HOA rules are in Chapter 15, and they clearly state that no homeowners association can claim power over properties that weren't included in the original documents." Tessa's smile broke for just a second, but she recovered quickly. "Well, regardless of the technical details, the fact is that your property doesn't meet our community standards. Your cabin brings down property values for everyone else." She waved at my grandfather's carefully built log cabin like it was some kind of eyesore. "We're giving you 12 hours to pack up and leave voluntarily, or we'll be forced to take legal action." The threat was delivered with such confidence that I almost had to admire her nerve. Almost. I stood up slowly, walked to the edge of my porch, and looked out over the property that had been in my family for almost 60 years. The cabin was solid and well-maintained, sitting exactly where my grandfather had built it, well within our property lines. "You know what's really interesting about this situation?" I said, turning back to face them. "I used to be a lawyer before I got into real estate development. I know exactly what kind of legal authority you'd need to make the demands you're making. And I know you don't have it." Tessa's face started to show real anger. The fake smile finally began to crack. "That doesn't matter. I'm working for the good of our community. You're just thinking about yourself." Clinton was now sweating and kept looking at Tessa like he was waiting for permission to run away. "Look, maybe we should," Clinton started to say, but Tessa cut him off with a sharp look. "No, Clinton. We came here to do what's right for our neighbors, and that's exactly what we're going to do." She turned back to me with renewed determination. "Mr. Carver, You have until tonight to remove yourself and your belongings from this property. If you're not gone by then, you'll be hearing from our legal team." She pulled out her phone and started walking toward my driveway, already beginning to film herself. I just want to document that we tried to resolve this situation peacefully. Unfortunately, we encountered a resident with concerning behavior who refuses to cooperate with basic community safety measures. I watched them walk back to their beat-up car with Tessa still talking into her phone, probably broadcasting her version of our meeting to whoever would listen. The whole situation would have been almost funny if it wasn't so obviously designed to scare me into giving up my property. The harassment started exactly 12 hours after Tessa's visit. At 6 o'clock in the morning, I was woken up by someone pounding on my front door, claiming to be from various county departments. Noise complaints, health inspections, environmental problems. When I asked for ID and legal authority for these inspections, each one made quick excuses and disappeared. I called the actual county offices and confirmed that none of these visits were real. But the real escalation came when my power went out around 10:30, even though the utility company had no record of any scheduled work in my area. When the real utility guy arrived to investigate, he was genuinely puzzled. Someone definitely called this in as a real service request, but they used a fake work order number. We're going to have to file a report about this because pretending to be a utility customer is actually a federal crime. Mike, the technician, had been working the area for 15 years and had never seen anything this elaborate. He told me to document everything and consider installing security cameras because people willing to fake government officials usually don't stop there. I spent the rest of the afternoon setting up a basic security system and starting a detailed log of every incident, knowing that if this turned into a legal battle, I'd need solid proof of their harassment. That evening brought the first glimpse of Tessa's real plan when my neighbor Lois Whitaker called. "Wade, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I heard about some trouble you're having with that new woman, Tessa something. She came by my house yesterday trying to get me to sign some kind of petition about community safety concerns." Lois had lived in Ash Hollow for over 30 years and knew practically everyone in the area. She kept talking about isolated residents who might pose risks to families and asking a lot of questions about you specifically. This confirmed what I'd suspected. Tessa wasn't just targeting me directly, she was trying to turn the entire neighborhood against me by spreading fear and lies. When I asked what kind of questions, Lois described the typical busybody nonsense about how long I'd lived there, whether I had visitors, and whether she'd ever heard suspicious noises or seen anything concerning. She was really pushing the idea that people who live alone in isolated cabins are somehow dangerous. "Complete garbage if you ask me," Lois said with obvious disgust. I told her you've been nothing but a good neighbor for 3 years, and if she had real concerns, she should talk to you directly instead of gossiping behind your back. But Lois also warned me that Tessa had managed to get several neighbors to sign her petition, including families who didn't really know me but were worried about property values. The community was being divided by fear tactics and lies, exactly what someone running a property scam would want to achieve. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just harassment. It was a calculated campaign to isolate me and create justification for whatever Tessa was really planning. The breakthrough came when Lois called with crucial information she'd gathered from her network of longtime neighbors. "Wade, you need to know what's really going on here. Tessa has been approaching several property owners about selling their land, telling people that the whole area is going to be developed into some kind of luxury resort and that property values are going to go through the roof if they get in early." This was the missing piece I'd been looking for. The fake HOA, the harassment campaign, the community safety nonsense. It was all a cover for a real estate scam. "There's more," Lois continued. "Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who owns the big house that Tessa's been renting, told me that Tessa has been pressuring her to sell at a way below market price, claiming there's some kind of urgent development opportunity. And here's the interesting part. Apparently there's a natural spring somewhere on or near your property that's supposed to be a key feature of this resort development." Suddenly everything made perfect sense. Tessa wasn't just trying to drive me off my land for kicks. She was trying to get properties for a development project, and my cabin was sitting right on top of something valuable. The spring that fed the creek behind my property was probably worth more than I'd ever imagined, and Tessa had figured out a way to try to steal it through intimidation and fake legal pressure. Armed with Lois's information about the natural spring, I decided it was time to do some serious investigating. I started by digging through my grandfather's old property documents, and what I found exceeded my wildest expectations. Not only did my property include full water rights to the spring, but there were also mineral rights that extended well beyond the cabin's footprint. According to the original deed, I owned exclusive access to a natural spring with an estimated flow rate of 500 gallons per minute, more than enough to supply a resort or any commercial development. My grandfather had been thorough when he purchased the land, securing every possible right that came with the property. This explained why Tessa was so desperate to get me off the land. Without access to the spring, her entire development scheme would be worthless. I hired a private investigator to look into Tessa's background, and the results were fascinating. She had a history of exactly this kind of scheme, operating in different counties to avoid detection. In the past 5 years, she'd been involved in at least 3 similar situations where she'd created fake HOAs to pressure property owners into selling at below-market prices. In 2 cases, she'd successfully gotten the properties and flipped them to developers for big profits. The third had ended with criminal charges when she'd forged county documents. Clinton turned out to be an even bigger fraud. He'd attended law school for 1 semester before dropping out but had been representing himself as a legal expert for years, providing fake documentation and intimidating property owners with threats he had no authority to make. The most interesting discovery was that Tessa wasn't even a real property owner in Ash Hollow. She was renting from Mrs. Patterson on a month-to-month lease with an option to buy, but she'd never exercised that option because she didn't have the money for a down payment. Her entire scheme depended on getting enough surrounding properties to create a valuable development package that she could sell to a real developer. When I contacted Mountain View Resort Development, the company Tessa had apparently been negotiating with, they were extremely interested in discussing a partnership. We had no idea that the woman we'd been talking to didn't actually own the key properties, the development manager told me. We'd much rather work directly with the legitimate property owners. Their offer was substantial, not to buy my property, but to lease the water rights for a guaranteed annual payment that would set me up for life. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Patterson called me directly, sounding extremely upset. "Mr. Carver, I hope you don't mind me reaching out, but I'm in a terrible situation. Tessa has been pressuring me to sell my house at a price that's way below market value, claiming that if I don't sell immediately, some kind of community development is going to make my property worthless." Mrs. Patterson was 82 years old and living on a fixed income since her husband's death. She's been telling me that there are going to be legal problems with the neighborhood association and that I could end up owing thousands of dollars in fines if I don't cooperate. This was clearly elder abuse, and it gave me the perfect opportunity to turn the tables on Tessa completely. I arranged to meet with Mrs. Patterson the next day, bringing my real estate attorney to explain her actual legal situation and options. What we discovered was that Mrs. Patterson's property was worth at least twice what Tessa had been offering, and that she had absolutely no obligation to sell to anyone. More importantly, she was completely fed up with Tessa's bullying tactics. "That woman has been making my life miserable for months," Mrs. Patterson told us. "She acts like she owns the place, threatens me with legal action every week, and keeps telling me I'm too old to manage my own property. I'd love nothing more than to see her get what she deserves." By the end of our meeting, Mrs. Patterson had agreed to sell her property to me instead, at a fair market price that would give her enough money to move to a nice senior community near her daughter. The sale would also give me ownership of the house that Tessa was currently renting, putting me in position to serve her with a real eviction notice. But I decided to keep this development secret until the sale was completed, giving Tessa just enough rope to hang herself with her increasingly desperate tactics. The closing was scheduled for the following week, and I couldn't wait to see the look on Tessa's face when she realized that her victim had become her landlord. The irony would be absolutely perfect. The woman who had tried to kick me off my own land would find herself homeless because of her own illegal schemes. While the paperwork moved forward, I continued documenting Tessa's harassment campaign, knowing that every fake legal document and intimidation tactic would become evidence in the criminal case I was planning to file. She was digging her own grave deeper with every passing day, completely unaware that her world was about to collapse around her. Tessa's financial desperation became clear through the private investigator's research. She was deeply in debt with multiple maxed-out credit cards and a history of failed business ventures. Her rental payments to Mrs. Patterson were often late, and she'd been served with eviction notices twice before, talking her way into extensions. Her entire lifestyle was financed by credit, and she desperately needed this scheme to work to avoid bankruptcy. My property, with its valuable water rights, represented her last chance to make enough money to dig herself out of the financial hole she'd created. This explained the increasingly frantic and reckless nature of her harassment campaign. She was running out of time and options, making her more dangerous but also more likely to make the kind of mistakes that would destroy her completely. While the paperwork for Mrs. Patterson's property sale moved forward quietly, Tessa's harassment campaign reached new levels of desperation. She had apparently figured out that fake inspectors weren't working, so she shifted to more direct intimidation. Clinton filed what he claimed was a formal legal complaint with the county, alleging that my cabin violated multiple building codes and environmental regulations. When I called the county to ask about it, they had no record of anything filed by Clinton Ames or any Ash Hollow Homeowners Association. It turned out that Clinton had simply sent threatening letters on fake letterhead, hoping I wouldn't bother to verify their legitimacy. The fake legal documents were elaborate, complete with official-looking seals and made-up case numbers, even including a fake court date where I was supposedly required to appear and defend my property rights. By the end of the week, I had become the legal owner of the house Tessa was renting, though she had no idea that anything had changed. Mrs. Patterson had agreed to let me handle informing Tessa about the ownership change in my own way and timing. I was planning to make it as dramatic and satisfying as possible. The woman who had spent weeks trying to drive me off my property through fake legal threats was about to discover that she was now at the mercy of the very person she'd been trying to destroy. The tables had turned completely, and Tessa had no idea what was coming. All I had to do was wait for the perfect moment to spring my trap and watch her world fall apart. The closing on Mrs. Patterson's property took place on a Wednesday morning at my attorney's office, with Mrs. Patterson looking relieved and excited about her move to the senior community. "I can't tell you how happy I am to be done with all this drama," she told me as we signed the final paperwork. "Tessa has been making my life miserable for months, and I'm looking forward to living somewhere peaceful again." With the deed transfer complete, I was now officially Tessa's landlord, though she had no idea that anything had changed. That same afternoon, Tessa made her biggest mistake yet. Apparently frustrated by my continued refusal to be intimidated, she decided to escalate to what she probably thought was the nuclear option. Clinton filed what he claimed was a restraining order petition against me, alleging that I had threatened community safety through intimidating behavior and refusal to comply with lawful authority. The petition was filled with completely made-up incidents, claiming I had aggressively confronted community representatives and made threats against neighborhood families. Of course, Clinton had no authority to file actual legal documents, but this fake petition crossed the line from harassment into criminal fraud. More importantly, she'd made specific allegations that could be easily disproven with the security camera footage I'd been collecting. I decided it was time to spring my trap. First, I contacted the county sheriff's office and filed a formal complaint about the fake legal documents, providing evidence of Clinton's fraudulent activities and Tessa's harassment campaign. The deputy who took my report was very interested in the fake restraining order petition, especially since impersonating legal authority is a serious felony. "We've been getting more of these fake HOA cases lately," the deputy told me. "People think they can intimidate their neighbors with official-looking paperwork, but they don't realize how serious the criminal penalties are." Next, I arranged for a process server to deliver a formal notice to Tessa, informing her that the property ownership had changed and that I was now her landlord. I wanted to see how she'd react to this news before delivering the final blow. The process server found Tessa at home around 6 o'clock in the evening, and according to his report, her reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for. She seemed completely shocked. First, she claimed it was impossible. Then she demanded to see proof. Then she started making threats about legal action and community safety concerns. She was definitely rattled. Tessa's panic became even more obvious when she called me directly about an hour later, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. She accused me of tricking Mrs. Patterson and claimed I was harassing community safety advocates. When I calmly explained that I was indeed her landlord and that Mrs. Patterson had been relieved to escape her bullying tactics, there was a long pause before she finally said, "This isn't over. I have resources you don't know about." The next morning brought the most satisfying development yet. Tessa, clearly operating in full panic mode, decided to file what she claimed was an emergency injunction to prevent me from retaliating against community safety advocates through property manipulation. She'd convinced Clinton to draft an official-looking petition requesting immediate court intervention to protect her from my escalating harassment tactics. The document was quite impressive from a creative writing standpoint, full of legal-sounding language and dramatic claims about community safety and tenant rights. Unfortunately for Tessa, she made the mistake of trying to file this fake injunction at the actual county courthouse, where the clerk immediately recognized it as fraudulent and called security. Within minutes, both Tessa and Clinton were being questioned by sheriff's deputies about their attempt to file false legal documents. According to the deputy who called me later, Tessa had insisted she was a legitimate community leader protecting neighborhood safety, while Clinton had tried to claim he was a legal representative operating within proper guidelines. The courthouse incident was the final straw for many of Tessa's remaining supporters in the community. Word spread quickly that she'd been arrested for filing fake court documents, and suddenly her claims about being a legitimate community advocate looked much less credible. Several neighbors who had signed her petition called to ask if they could remove their names, and the emergency meetings she'd been organizing stopped attracting attendees. By the weekend, I was ready to deliver the final blow. I had the process server deliver a formal 30-day eviction notice to Tessa, citing her month-to-month rental agreement and my right as the new property owner to reclaim the premises. The notice was completely legal and properly executed, unlike every fake document she'd been throwing around for weeks. But the real masterpiece was the language I'd included. You have 30 days to vacate the premises and remove all personal property. This notice is being served in accordance with state landlord-tenant law and represents the legitimate exercise of property ownership rights. It was almost word for word what she'd said to me in that first fake eviction notice, except this time it was real. The woman who had tried to kick me off my own land was about to be evicted by the very person she'd been trying to destroy. The irony was absolutely perfect. Tessa's reaction to the real eviction notice was everything I could have hoped for and more. According to Lois, who witnessed the scene from her kitchen window, Tessa came running out of the house screaming at the process server, demanding to know who gave him authority to deliver harassment documents to community safety advocates. She tried to refuse the notice, claiming it was another fake legal document designed to intimidate legitimate HOA representatives. But the process server calmly explained that it was a real eviction notice filed through proper legal channels. When Tessa realized this wasn't another one of her fake documents, she completely lost control and started making threats about exposing this conspiracy to destroy community safety initiatives. The next few days were a masterclass in watching a scam artist's world fall apart in real time. Tessa tried to rally community support by organizing what she called an emergency response to landlord harassment, but only 3 people showed up, and 2 of them left when they realized the meeting was just Tessa ranting about conspiracies and revenge plots. Clinton, meanwhile, had completely abandoned ship after the courthouse incident, throwing Tessa under the bus and claiming she'd misrepresented her authority and misled him about the legal validity of their initiatives. The community's rejection of Tessa became increasingly visible and personal. One by one, neighbors who had signed her original petition began calling to formally withdraw their names, with some even requesting written confirmation that they were no longer associated with her fake HOA. The criminal investigation was moving forward quickly, with charges pending against Tessa for fraud, harassment, filing false documents, and elder abuse related to her treatment of Mrs. Patterson. The prosecutor was particularly interested in her history of similar schemes in other counties, and my private investigator's research was proving invaluable in building a pattern of criminal behavior. This is exactly the kind of case we like to prosecute, the district attorney told me. Serial scam artists who target elderly victims and use fake legal authority to steal people's property deserve serious consequences. On the final day of her 30-day eviction notice, Tessa made one last desperate attempt to avoid leaving. She barricaded herself in the house and called the local news station, claiming she was a victim of property harassment and community safety retaliation. The news crew that showed up was the same reporter who had written the exposé article, so instead of getting sympathetic coverage, Tessa found herself being asked pointed questions about her criminal charges and fraudulent activity. The sheriff's deputies who arrived to enforce the eviction were professional and efficient, giving Tessa a final opportunity to leave voluntarily before removing her belongings to the curb. She spent the entire eviction process screaming about illegal harassment and community safety conspiracies, but nobody was listening anymore. By sunset, Tessa was loading her possessions into a rental truck, and by morning she was gone from Ash Hollow forever. The aftermath was swift and satisfying. Tessa's criminal case resulted in felony convictions for fraud, filing false documents, and elder abuse, earning her 3 years in state prison and substantial restitution payments to Mrs. Patterson and other victims. Clinton received probation and community service in exchange for his cooperation, but his reputation was permanently destroyed. The Mountain View Resort development proceeded exactly as planned, with construction beginning on a luxury spa that would preserve the environmental integrity of the area while providing me with substantial annual income from the water rights lease. My cabin remained exactly where it had always been, now enhanced by professional landscaping and surrounded by hiking trails that complemented rather than competed with its rustic charm. Justice had been served in the most poetic way possible, and the entire community felt safer knowing that property scam artists would face real consequences for their crimes. 6 months after Tessa's eviction, Ash Hollow had returned to the peaceful community it had always been, but with valuable lessons learned about protecting property rights and recognizing scam artists. Mrs. Patterson was thriving in her new senior community, where she'd quickly become a leader in organizing social activities and advocating for residents' rights. "Getting away from that horrible woman was the best thing that ever happened to me," she told me during one of our regular calls. "I had no idea how much stress I was carrying until it was gone." As I sit on my front porch now, watching the sunset over the same peaceful landscape my grandfather loved 60 years earlier, I reflect on how the whole experience changed my perspective on community, justice, and standing up for what's right. Tessa had tried to destroy my peace and steal my property through lies and intimidation, but her scheme had ultimately backfired in the most spectacular way possible. She'd ended up in prison while I'd become more prosperous and secure than ever before. The fake HOA that was supposed to drive me away had instead created opportunities that transformed my life for the better. The natural spring that she'd tried to steal was now providing sustainable income while being protected and shared responsibly with the wider community. Sometimes the best defense really is becoming their landlord and evicting them from the community they tried to steal. Justice has a way of working out in the end, especially when good people are willing to stand up to bullies and fight for what's right. The woman who demanded I leave my cabin in 12 hours learned the hard way that some people refuse to be intimidated, and that karma has a perfect sense of timing when it comes to delivering justice to those who deserve it.